Chapter 12, Cognitive Topics in Personality. So in this chapter, we are going to be looking at personality revealed through perception, personality revealed through interpretation, through goals, and then look a little bit at intelligence. So this chapter 12, this cognitive, beginning of the cognitive topics, we'll just go back here a couple of slides. That is the beginning of part 3, this domain here. Remember, we started with this dispositional domain, then we did the biological domain, biological perspectives of personality and personality development. And in this section, this part 3, and for the next couple of chapters, we're going to be looking at the cognitive domain. So what does that mean? So while the biological domain was interested in the biological underpinnings of personality, this chapter here is looking at cognitive, which is looking at how people, the perceptions of the world, their thoughts, their feelings, their desires, their goals. 3 types of experience cognitive psychologists are interested in. It's cognitive emotional experiences of self, but we're going to be looking at this one. Okay? How we interpret and make sense of life events. How we decide on the causes for events. How we assign responsibility for things, right? How and why people formulate goals for themselves. People see things differently, right? There's lots of individual differences of how people make sense of the world. 2 people, 3, 4, whatever, can look at the same situation and see things differently. There can be things that happen in your life or in the world, and we attribute how that happened. People see things differently and make different attributions to the exact same event. Okay, so that's what we're going to be looking at in this chapter. Cognitive approaches focus on how people think and process information on their environment. So if you look at this is a good example here. Well, first of all, let's just remember cognition refers to awareness and thinking. It's the information processing model, right? So a lot of the cognitive approach has to do, like the brain is analogous to a computer. How we think, how things are remembered, how things are stored, how things are, memories are constructed, those types of things. So a really good example that they cite in the text is to do with this Necker cube. And what they're saying is when you look at this Necker cube, first of all, it's a flat object made of lines. We perceive it as a 3-dimensional object, right? So we're perceiving it differently than it is, first of all. And then secondly, some people are going to perceive this as the box coming in at us. Some people see the box as going back. Some people see the box as slanting off to the right, to the left. So people see the exact same object in different ways. And what they're suggesting here is that if we are all perceiving this one box differently, then imagine how much more complicated it is when we are all looking at the same social world and we're all perceiving that differently. So 3 levels of cognition that interests personality psychologists. Perception, how you perceive the world, right? So how you take things in. That's the process of imposing order on information received from our sense organs. Interpretation. How do you make sense of the world or make sense of events or explain events that happen in the world? And then thirdly, goals. Goals that we have for ourselves. Like, what is important? What do I want to pursue? Individual differences in that. What do we perceive to be standards and goals people develop for evaluating themselves and others? What is important in life? What goals are appropriate to pursue, right? Which also states a lot about our personality, things that we deem as important or goal-worthy, as they say. A lot of that is a direct reflection of our personalities. So back to here. So in this video, we had our slight introduction into what cognitive psychology, cognitive topics, and personality is. And then we're going to cover this first section, personality revealed through perception. Then we're going to look through and look at some theories, Kelly's personal construct theory and locus of control, and learn helplessness in the next video. So first, personality revealed through perception. Okay. So it's first important to understand the premise, which is that reality is what you perceive. There is no one objective reality, right? So everything that you see in the world when you're looking around, it is not one objective reality. There's no one truth out there. Everything is as you perceive it to be. And again, many of us perceive the exact same reality in different ways. So the perceiver contributes to the mental representation of what they see. And there are differences among people in what they see. Perceptual differences can be stable, consistent, and meaningfully related to other areas of their lives. So the way you perceive the outside world becomes your understanding and your knowledge and the way you believe things to be. And of course, that's going to affect all parts of your life. So an important piece here is field independence. There's two ways in which people perceive things differently that are very well researched in cognitive psych. First is field dependence, and then the second is pain tolerance. So we're going to start with field dependence. Field independent relative to field dependent people have the ability to focus on details despite the clutter of background information. Hold on. What this means is, I'm going to jump forward in the slide and then we'll come back. You've all seen these, right? Where you've got, can you find the hidden pictures? So there's supposed to be a parrot, a boot, a glasses, a shark, a screwdriver. All of these things are in this picture. So when you look at this picture, can you only see this big animal here? Does that dominate your field? Or are you able to easily find these little pieces that are embedded in there? So that's what field dependence is. If you are field dependent, it means that you rely on the entire field of what you're looking at to make your judgments. If you're field independent, it means you do not see that first necessarily, and you're able to see the little pieces because you can see it independently. So we'll come back to that. So there's two ways that they measure field dependence. Okay. And there's one now. They started out with the rod and frame test. That was originally the test that they did. Turns out that it's accurate, but it's a little monotonous and difficult and time consuming. So they came up with embedded figures test, which is easier to administer. So we'll look at the rod and frame test first. That's a very busy slide. But anyways, it's all on one slide. Field independent people have the ability to focus on details despite the clutter of background information. Okay? So you can see the tiny details of the picture instead of being distracted by the big picture. So they developed this test. It's called the rod and frame test, designed to measure, identify what cues a person uses to judge orientation in space. So somebody sits on one of these chairs and they're looking through and they see this bright line, okay, inside of this box. If you see an object that is tilted, how do you know? So how do you know that the object is tilted or if you are tilted? That is the gist of what this is. So is this line tilted or are you tilted? Okay. Are you relying, to make that judgment, people either use cues in the environment, which is the box surrounding it, or they can rely on their bodily cues. Right? Are you upright or are you tilted? So here's the apparatus and procedure. You're sitting in a dark room. You sit and watch a glowing rod surrounded by a square frame. The experimenter can adjust the rod, address the frame, or the person's chair. The participant must make the rod straight. If the participant adjusts the rod so that it's leaning in the direction of the tiled frame, that person is field dependent. If the participant ignores the external cues and instead uses the information from their bodies to adjust the rod, then they are field independent. Okay, does that make sense? So if they're looking only at the box and they ignore their body cues, or only looking at the box, they're field dependent. They only can use that information that's in front of them. They're field independent if they can ignore the obvious box and rely on their body cues that are telling them that they are tilted or straight. Okay, so as I said, RFT, rod and frame test. Difficult, time-consuming, created another way to do it, which is this embedded figures test, which is a little more fun to do. The object is to find as many of the smaller hidden figures as possible. So some people have difficulty finding the smaller objects, so they're so distracted with this picture that they can't find these little pieces. So they're field dependent. And then some people can see this, but they're quite easily able to find these tiny little details that are embedded in there, and they are field independent. What research has found is that people's scores on these field dependence tests are consistent over time. So you are either dependent or independent. So research has extended investigating field dependence and field independence. That is how you perceive things. So how do you perceive other things in your life? Does it have a consequence on life choices that you make or other things that you do? And the answer is yes. 2 areas of research, education and interpersonal relations. So Witkin, are the differences in perception related to other differences in personality function? Witten, 1979, he did a study following 1,548 students. They were measured on whether field dependent and field independent. And then he followed them for choices of majors in university and several years after that, and they looked at interpersonal relations. So it was a very, very, very long-term study where they watched what decisions these people made in life, and 2 really stood out. One was education. And what they found is that whether they were field dependent or independent made a difference in their choice of major, which makes sense, right? Field independent people favored natural science, math, engineering. Field dependent people tended to favor things like social sciences and education. So perhaps independent, they're able to sciences, math, engineering, they're able to see past the big picture and see the tiny details of things, right? Whereas field dependent people, social sciences and education, possibly looking more at the big picture things. The other area in their lives where this was impacted was interpersonal relations. So field independent people are more interpersonally detached. Functions with autonomy, they're more impersonal. They're not as interested in other people's opinions, and they have preference for non-social situations. Whereas people who are field dependent tend to rely on social information. They ask other people for their opinions and ideas about things. They're attentive to social cues, and they're just in general oriented towards people. Okay, they show a strong interest in others, and they get along well with others. Right? Okay, so again, this is how, whether you're field independent or dependent, how you perceive the world does show up in other areas of your life, and has an impact on those things. More current research on this focuses on how people react to situations that are rich in sensory stimulation, and whether field independent people can focus on a task and screen out distracting information. Okay, so what they had was 100 police officers, and they had them watching something where there was a lot of noise, and it was a simulated shooting situation. Okay, so there's a lot of distractions and a lot of noise, and there's guns going off. So the field independent officers, they were predicted to notice more details more accurately and be less distracted by the noise, right? Because they're able to see the details, they're able to see past the big picture of things and see the details. Whereas field dependent people would be more distracted by the big picture and less focused on the small details. And that's exactly what they found. Field independent people performed better, and they had better descriptions of the witnesses that were in the video, right? So what does this say? What more information does this tell us about the difference between field independent and field dependent? Field independent people, they're better able to screen out distracting information and focus on a task. They learn more effectively than field-dependent students in a hypermedia-based instructional environment where there's lots of distraction. They also found another study, they had an easier time learning a second language. Probably also because of their ability to learn fine details of something larger, right? Field-dependent people, they tend to process information in chunks, and they're good at seeing connections among different categories of information. They have stronger social skills, and they tend to be more attentive to social context. Okay, so there's strengths of both, and definitely some differences. Another area where people perceive things differently is pain tolerance. I'm talking about pain tolerance within terms of sensation reducing and augmenting. So when somebody experiences pain, or people react very, very differently to the same amount of pain. So maybe you know somebody who when something bad happens or they have to get, needle or stitches or anything, some people, they're totally fine with it. It doesn't hurt. Whereas other people are freaking out at the smallest thing, right? So people react very, very differently to the same amount of pain. Some people seem to be able to easily tolerate it, and other people freak out. So Petrie studied people in hospitals undergoing painful operations as well as normal subjects whom she induced pain. Okay, so people are already going through painful operations, or if normal subjects, and they would hang weights on their fingers or something, or have heat, right? And the point was to quantify how well each subject tolerated the pain. And she came out with a theory, reducer-augmenter theory of pain tolerance. So people with low pain tolerance have a nervous system that amplifies or augmented the amount of pain that actually was felt. Whereas people with a high pain tolerance have a nervous system that reduces the effects of the sensory information. So it's all about the nervous system. Petrie believed that individual differences in pain tolerance originate in the nervous system. So the same amount of pain, but the nervous system blows up the pain, right? Makes it seem really, really painful for amplified. Or some people have the pain and the nervous system sort of reduces it, and it's not perceived as strongly. Other research that's been done around this idea, pain reducers, they show a relatively small brain responses to flashes of light. So if you're flashing light and you've got a random group of people, and you'll have augmenters and you're going to have reducers, right? When they're flashing the light, reducers have smaller brain responses to it. They're not as responsive. They also have smaller brain responses to bursts of noise, and they report the noise was less loud than the augmenters. It was the same sound. So they don't perceive the sound as loud. And they also have small, less responses to the noise. The brain-evoked response increases with increasing stimuli intensity, but the rate of perceived change is different for different people. So the response increases with increasing stimulus intensity, but the rate of perceived change is different for different people. So augmenters show a steeper rate of change. So if there's a sound, their response is very, very quick and very steep when they're measuring it, right? The brain-evoked potential augmenting reducing measure shows high test, retest reliability. So whether you are an augmenter or a reducer is consistent across time. They also say they found the same response of the nervous system in animals, specifically with cats and rats. And then they've also found the same individual difference has been demonstrated in infants. What does this say possibly about personality? Reducers should be motivated to seek strong stimulation, right? So if you're a person who is a reducer, things are a roller coaster. Let's say a roller coaster. A roller coaster to a reducer, the same roller coaster, is not going to be as exciting as it is to an augmenter. An augmenter might get on the roller coaster and be freaking out, whereas a reducer is like, okay, this is boring, right? So reducers tend to seek out stronger stimulation so that they can get the rush, because their nervous system is going to dampen whatever rush they're getting, right? So they have found, research has shown that reducers tend to drink more coffee, they smoke more, they have a lower threshold for boredom, tend to be more involved in drugs, they listen to louder music, more alcoholism associated with that. What does this have with personality? We're going to see this throughout the textbook, so it doesn't get into a lot of detail here, but when it comes to personality, this pain tolerance and sensations, reducing and augmenting, it's implicated in sensation-seeking behaviors and on the big five, extroversion, right? So extroverted people would be the reducers, looking for more stimulation and more excitement. Okay. So that is the end of this video, and I will see you in part 2, personality revealed through interpretation.